The morning sun was just breaking over the Montana hills when Jessica noticed something was wrong. She'd been working at the Broken Arrow Ranch for 3 years now, and she knew every horse like family. Today, during the usual morning check, her heart sank when she saw Dusty limping badly near the east fence. Dusty was a beautiful chestnut mare, gentle as they come. Kids loved riding her because she never spooked or acted up. But right now something was clearly hurting her. Jessica could see it in the way she was favoring her right front leg, barely putting any weight on it. "Hey girl, what happened to you?" Jessica called softly, walking slowly toward the injured horse with a halter in one hand and some grain in the other. This usually worked like magic. Dusty loved her morning treats and would come running, well, walking quickly anyway. But today was different. As Jessica got closer, maybe about 20 feet away, Dusty did something completely unexpected. The mare's ears flattened against her head, her eyes went wide, and despite that bad leg, she turned and ran. Not just a quick trot, but a full panicked gallop toward the tree line. Jessica stood there in shock for a moment. In 3 years, Dusty had never run from her. Never. Something was seriously wrong, and it wasn't just the leg injury. The horse seemed almost desperate to get away, like she had somewhere she needed to be. "Tom, we've got a problem," Jessica spoke into her radio. Tom was the ranch foreman, been there for over 20 years. "Dusty's hurt bad and she just bolted into the pine forest. I'm going after her." "Wait for backup," Tom's voice crackled back. "Can't wait. She's bleeding and heading into rough terrain. I'm taking the first aid kit." Jessica didn't wait for a response. She grabbed the emergency kit from the barn, filled a water bottle, and started jogging toward the spot where she'd seen Dusty disappear into the trees. The old pine forest was thick and wild, covering maybe 300 acres of the ranch's northern boundary. Most of the ranch hands avoided it because the ground was rocky and uneven, easy to twist an ankle or worse. As she entered the tree line, the temperature dropped a good 10 degrees. The morning sun couldn't quite break through the thick canopy overhead. Jessica paused, looking for signs of which way Dusty had gone. There, on a low branch, a tuft of chestnut hair, and on the ground, dark spots that made her stomach turn. "Blood drops, fresh ones. I'm coming, girl. Just hang on," Jessica whispered, following the trail deeper into the woods. The terrain got rougher with each step. Fallen logs covered in moss, rocks jutting up from the ground, thick underbrush that grabbed at her jeans. Jessica had to use her hands to push branches aside, and more than once she slipped on loose stones. How was Dusty managing this with an injured leg? After about 45 minutes of climbing and pushing through the forest, Jessica was starting to worry. The blood trail was getting heavier, which meant Dusty's wound was getting worse with all this running. She checked her phone, no signal. Of course not this deep in the woods. Then she heard it. The sound of water running. That didn't make sense. Jessica had studied every map of this ranch, and there was no creek marked anywhere in this section. The nearest water source was supposed to be a good mile south of here. Following the sound, she pushed through a particularly thick patch of wild brambles, ignoring the thorns that scratched her arms. And then she stopped dead in her tracks. There was a clearing ahead, maybe 30 feet across, and right in the middle of it was a spring. Crystal clear water bubbled up from between rocks, creating a small pool before trickling away into the ground. The sight was beautiful, almost magical with the way filtered sunlight made the water sparkle. But that wasn't what made Jessica's breath catch in her throat. Standing beside the spring, calmly drinking, was Dusty. Her injured leg was in the water, and she looked peaceful, like she'd finally found what she was looking for. Around the spring, barely visible through years of overgrowth, were the unmistakable shapes of old structures. A collapsed cabin, its roof caved in and walls leaning at crazy angles. A rusted water pump, its handle frozen in place. And scattered around the clearing, covered in moss and fallen leaves, were several stone markers, graves. This was an old graveyard, a forgotten homestead that nobody had mentioned in all her time at the ranch. Jessica felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the exertion of the hike. How was this possible? How had this place been lost and forgotten? Dusty lifted her head from the water and looked at Jessica, and for just a moment the cowgirl could have sworn the horse looked almost knowing, like she'd led her here on purpose. Like this discovery was meant to happen. Jessica took a deep breath and slowly approached the mare, her mind racing with questions. What was this place? Who was buried here? And how on earth had Dusty known about a hidden spring that wasn't on any map? She had a feeling that answering those questions was going to change everything she thought she knew about this ranch. And as she knelt beside Dusty to examine that injured leg, Jessica realized that sometimes animals know things we don't. Sometimes, they can lead us to discoveries we never imagined possible. This was just the beginning of a story that had been waiting over 100 years to be told. The trail Dusty had left wasn't easy to follow at all. Jessica had done some tracking before, helped find lost cattle a few times, but this was different. The mare's path twisted and turned through the densest parts of the forest, almost like she was following some invisible route that only she could see. Blood spots on leaves told the story Jessica didn't want to read. The injury was serious, maybe more serious than she'd first thought. Every 20 feet or so, she'd find another dark red spot on a rock or smeared on tree bark where Dusty had brushed past. The horse had to be in real pain, yet she'd pushed through this rough terrain with determination. "What were you looking for, girl?" Jessica muttered to herself, ducking under a low-hanging branch covered in spider webs. She wiped the sticky strands from her face and kept moving. The forest here was old growth, trees that had probably been standing for 100 years or more. Their thick trunks were covered in moss on the north side, and mushrooms grew in clusters around their roots. It was beautiful in a wild, untouched way, but it was also a bit eerie. The normal sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the shouts of other workers, the rumble of trucks on the gravel roads, all of that had faded away. Now there was only the crunch of Jessica's boots on dead leaves and the occasional call of a bird somewhere high in the canopy. After about an hour of steady climbing, Jessica had to admit she was getting worried. She'd gone farther from the ranch than she'd ever been before. This section of the property was marked on maps simply as forested area, with no details, no trails, nothing to indicate anyone had been here in years, maybe decades. The terrain was getting steeper too. She had to use her hands to pull herself up over some of the bigger rocks, and twice she nearly slipped on patches of loose shale. How in the world had Dusty managed this with 3 good legs? Then she heard it. At first, Jessica thought she was imagining things. The sound was faint, almost lost beneath the rustle of wind through pine needles. But no, it was definitely there. Running water. She stopped, tilted her head, and listened carefully. Yes, definitely water, and not just a trickle. It sounded like a decent flow, maybe a small stream or spring. But that couldn't be right. Jessica had studied the ranch maps plenty of times, even the old survey documents from the county office. There was no water source marked anywhere in this section. Curiosity pushed her forward faster now. She followed the sound, and the blood trail seemed to be heading in the same direction. The undergrowth got thicker here, wild brambles with thorns that grabbed at her shirt and scratched her arms. She pushed through anyway, ignoring the sting of the cuts, and then, quite suddenly, the forest opened up. Jessica stumbled into a clearing and just stood there, mouth open, taking in the impossible scene before her. It was like stepping through a doorway into another world, a secret place that time had forgotten. The clearing was maybe 30 or 40 feet across, roughly circular, ringed by those massive old pine trees that seemed to stand guard like silent sentries. In the very center, water bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks, creating a spring-fed pool about 6 feet wide. The water was so clear Jessica could see every pebble at the bottom, and it caught the filtered sunlight that somehow made it through the canopy, making the whole thing sparkle like something from a fairy tale. But it was what surrounded the spring that made Jessica's heart start pounding. There, drinking calmly from the pool with her injured leg submerged in the cold water, was Dusty. The mare looked almost peaceful, like she'd finally reached her destination after a long journey. Her ears were forward, relaxed, and she barely glanced at Jessica when she entered the clearing. "Dusty," Jessica breathed, taking a cautious step forward. "There you are, girl." But the horse wasn't what held Jessica's attention for long. Behind Dusty, barely visible through years of overgrowth and forest debris, were the unmistakable remains of human habitation. An old cabin, its roof completely collapsed in the middle but with one corner still partially intact. The logs that made up the walls were gray with age and covered in moss, and small trees were growing up through what used to be the floor. To the left of the cabin stood an old-fashioned water pump, the kind Jessica had only seen in museums or old Western movies. It was rusted solid, its handle pointing up at an angle, frozen in place by decades of weather and neglect, and scattered around the clearing, some near the spring and others closer to the cabin, were stone markers, grave markers, Jessica counted at least 4, maybe 5, though some were so covered in moss and fallen leaves it was hard to tell. A cold shiver ran down her spine despite the warmth from her hike. This was an old homestead, a place where people had lived and died, and somehow it had been completely forgotten. How was that even possible? Jessica stood there for a long moment, trying to process what she was seeing. In all her time at Broken Arrow Ranch, nobody had ever mentioned this place. Not Tom, who'd been there for 20 years. Not the owner, whose family had run the ranch for generations. Nobody. It was like this clearing existed in a pocket outside of time, waiting all these years for someone to find it again. And Dusty somehow had known it was here. Even injured and in pain, she'd pushed through rough terrain to reach this exact spot. She'd led Jessica here, whether she meant to or not. Jessica finally shook herself from her stunned state and focused on what was important. Dusty needed help, and questions about forgotten homesteads could wait until after she'd taken care of the mare. She approached slowly, talking softly. "Easy, girl. I'm not going to hurt you. Let's see what you've done to yourself." Dusty didn't move away this time. In fact, she seemed content to stand there in the cold spring water, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. And looking at the leg now, Jessica realized maybe the horse did know something. The cold water would reduce swelling, help with the pain, maybe even slow the bleeding. It was actually smart, treating the injury this way. Jessica knelt beside the pool, opened her first aid kit, and started examining the wound. It was a deep gash, probably from barbed wire or a sharp branch running about 4 inches along Dusty's cannon bone. It definitely needed stitches, but for now, Jessica could clean and bandage it. As she worked, her eyes kept drifting to those grave markers across the clearing. Who were they? When had they died? And why had this place been abandoned and forgotten? The shadows were getting longer, Jessica noticed. She'd been tracking Dusty for nearly 2 hours. They needed to head back before dark, but she knew she'd be returning to this place. There were too many questions, too many mysteries. And somehow Jessica felt like Dusty had brought her here for a reason, like this was a story that needed to be uncovered, secrets that had been buried long enough. After bandaging Dusty's leg with the supplies from her first aid kit, Jessica tied the mare's lead rope to a sturdy pine tree with enough slack so she could still drink from the spring. The cold water really did seem to be helping. The swelling was already less than it had been, and Dusty seemed comfortable, even content, standing there with her injured leg in the pool. "You rest here a bit, girl," Jessica said, patting the mare's neck. "I need to look around before we head back." The clearing was smaller than it had first appeared, maybe 30 feet across at its widest point. The spring was definitely the centerpiece, with everything else arranged around it in a rough circle. Jessica wondered if that was intentional, if whoever had lived here had built their homestead around this water source. She walked slowly toward the collapsed cabin, her boots crunching on decades of fallen pine needles and leaves. Up close, the structure was in worse shape than she'd thought. The roof had caved in completely, probably under the weight of snow during some long-ago winter. What remained of the walls leaned at dangerous angles, held up more by the surrounding forest growth than by their own structural integrity. But one corner of the cabin, the northeast corner, was protected by a massive fallen pine tree that had created a sort of natural shelter. The roof there was mostly intact, and Jessica could see that the floor in that section might still be solid enough to explore. She turned her attention to the water pump first. It stood about 4 feet tall, made of cast iron that had rusted to a dark reddish brown. The handle was frozen solid. Jessica tried to move it, but it wouldn't budge even a fraction of an inch. At the base of the pump, she noticed some lettering cast into the metal, but it was too corroded to read clearly. She could make out what might have been a date, 18-something, but the last 2 numbers were completely worn away. "Old," Jessica murmured. "Really old." Then she turned to face what she'd been avoiding looking at too closely: the graves. There were 5 of them that she could clearly identify, though there might have been more hidden under the thick carpet of moss and forest debris. They were arranged in 2 groups, one group of 3 stones close together near the spring, and 2 more stones set slightly apart closer to the cabin. Jessica approached the group of 3 first, her heart beating faster. She wasn't scared exactly, but there was something deeply sad about finding forgotten graves, people whose resting places had been lost to time and memory. The stones were rough cut, probably local rock, with letters carved deep into the surface, but over 100 years or more of weathering had filled those carved letters with dirt and moss, making them almost impossible to read. "I need to clean these off," Jessica said to herself. She knelt beside the largest of the 3 stones and started carefully clearing away the moss with her hands. It came off in thick, damp chunks that had probably been growing there for decades. As she worked, letters began to emerge. She pulled out her phone to use the flashlight, angling it to create shadows that made the worn carvings easier to read. The afternoon sun was getting lower, making the clearing darker, and she needed all the light she could get. The first line became clear. Elizabeth Granger. Jessica's breath caught. A name. This wasn't just an old grave anymore, it was a real person who had lived and died here. She kept working, clearing more moss from below the name. The next line showed dates, 1847, 1891. 44 years old, Jessica whispered. That's so young. Below the dates, one more line, beloved wife and mother. Jessica sat back on her heels, processing this. Elizabeth Granger had died in 1891. That was over 130 years ago, and she'd been a wife and mother, which meant there should be other graves here. The husband, probably, and children. She moved to the 2 smaller stones beside Elizabeth's. They were clearly children's graves, smaller markers set close to their mothers. Jessica went through the same process, carefully clearing away the moss and dirt, revealing the names beneath. The first small stone read, Thomas Granger, 1885, 1889. Just 4 years old. The second read, Mary Granger, 1887, 1889. Only 2 years old. Jessica felt tears stinging her eyes. 2 babies gone in the same year. Probably some kind of sickness. Maybe one of those diseases that used to sweep through frontier communities. Scarlet fever, or whooping cough, or any of a dozen other illnesses that could kill children back before modern medicine. I'm so sorry, she whispered, touching Thomas's headstone gently. You should have had so much more time. She stood up and walked over to the 2 graves set apart from the family. The first stone was even harder to read, the carving more weathered. She had to work for a long time before she could make out the name, Jacob Miller, 1823-1888. The second stone nearby was blank on the side facing out, but when Jessica walked around it, she found writing on the back. Stranger, died winter 1890. The Lord knows his name. That hit Jessica hard. An unknown person who died here, probably caught in a winter storm, and they'd been buried with dignity even though nobody knew who he was. That said something about the people who'd lived here, about their character and kindness. So that was 5 graves total, 2 adults and 3 children. The Granger family and a couple of others. But where was Mr. Granger? If Elizabeth had been a wife, there should be a husband's grave here too. William, maybe, or John, or whatever his name was. Jessica looked around the clearing carefully, checking for any other stones she might have missed, but there were no others visible. So what had happened to Mr. Granger? Had he left before Elizabeth died? Had he been buried somewhere else? The light was fading fast now. Jessica checked her watch and realized with a start that it was almost 5 in the evening. She'd been in this clearing for over 2 hours, and it would take at least another hour to get Dusty back to the ranch. Longer given her injury. We need to move, girl, Jessica said, walking back to untie Dusty. The mare seemed reluctant to leave the spring, which made sense. The cold water had helped her injury, and this place had drawn her here for some reason. But as Jessica prepared to lead Dusty out of the clearing, she took one last look around. This place felt important somehow, like it was trying to tell her something. The spring, the graves, the collapsed cabin, all of it was part of a story that nobody remembered anymore. I'll be back, Jessica promised the clearing, promised the Grangers resting in their forgotten graves. I'll figure out what happened here. I promise. She had no idea how much that promise would change her life, how deep this mystery really went, or how many people would be affected by the secrets this clearing held. But she meant it. She would come back, and she would uncover the truth about this forgotten homestead and the family who'd lived and died here all those years ago. As Jessica led Dusty out of the clearing and back into the darkening forest, she could have sworn she felt someone watching them go, not threatening but grateful, like the spirits of the Grangers knew their story was finally going to be told. Jessica couldn't stop thinking about the clearing, That night, after getting Dusty back to the ranch and having the vet look at her leg, 6 stitches, but she'd be fine. Jessica sat in her small cabin with her laptop open, searching for any information about the Granger family. The problem was, she didn't have much to go on. Elizabeth Granger died 1891. 2 children, Thomas and Mary, died 1889, that was it. And in the days before everything was digitized, records from Montana homesteads were spotty at best. But Jessica wasn't ready to give up. She stayed up until past midnight, searching through online archives, historical society databases, anything she could find. Finally, exhausted, she fell asleep at her desk, dreaming of moss-covered gravestones and crystal-clear springs. The next morning, she was back at it. But first, she needed to tell Tom and the ranch owner about what she'd found. That conversation happened over breakfast in the ranch house kitchen. A what? Tom nearly choked on his coffee when Jessica described the clearing. A homestead. Old one, probably from the 1880s. There's a collapsed cabin, an old water pump, and 5 graves. I took pictures. She pulled out her phone and showed them the photos she'd managed to take before the light got too low. Tom and Mr. Peterson, the ranch owner, leaned in close, studying each image. Mr. Peterson was a quiet man in his 60s, whose family had owned Broken Arrow for 4 generations. He looked genuinely puzzled as he scrolled through the photos. "I've never heard of any homestead in that section," he said slowly, "and my grandfather never mentioned anything either." "Are you sure this is on our property?" "Positive. It's maybe 2 miles northeast of the main barn, deep in that old pine forest nobody goes into." "The Grangers," Tom read from one of the photos. "That name doesn't ring any bells." "Hey, boss. You got those old property documents from when your great-great-grandfather bought this place?" Mr. Peterson nodded slowly. "Yeah, up in the office. Give me a few minutes." He left, and Jessica and Tom sat in silence, both thinking about the implications of this discovery. A forgotten homestead meant forgotten people, forgotten stories. It felt wrong somehow, like they'd failed these people by letting their memory fade away so completely. Mr. Peterson came back carrying a dusty cardboard box. "Everything from the original land purchase in 1892, he said, setting it on the table. "Haven't looked through this stuff in years." Together, they started sorting through the documents. There were survey maps yellowed with age, legal documents describing property boundaries, a hand-drawn map showing the location of the ranch house, the barn, various pastures, and then at the bottom of the box they found it, the original deed of sale, dated June 15, 1892. "Seller's name," Jessica read, her voice shaking slightly. "William Granger." The room went silent. Tom and Mr. Peterson both leaned in to look. "Well, I'll be," Tom breathed. "He sold the ranch to your family, but it was the price that made Jessica's eyebrows shoot up. He sold it for almost nothing. $200 for over 1,000 acres. That can't be right." Mr. Peterson was reading further. "Wait, there's a note attached. Look." Clipped to the deed with a rusted paperclip was a small piece of paper. The ink faded but still readable. "Buyer agrees to maintain family cemetery in perpetuity. W.G." Jessica felt goosebumps rise on her arms. A family cemetery. The graves. William Granger sold the ranch on the condition that his family's graves would be taken care of forever. But nobody knew. Mr. Peterson said quietly, guilt clear in his voice. 4 generations and nobody knew. We forgot. We forgot our promise. The weight of that forgotten promise hung heavy in the kitchen. These were good people, Jessica knew that. The Peterson family took care of their land and their workers. They weren't the kind to deliberately break a promise. But somewhere along the way, as the forest reclaimed that clearing and the years piled up, the memory of the Grangers had simply faded away. "We need to make this right," Mr. Peterson said firmly. "Jessica, I want you to find out everything you can about the Granger family. Tom, get a crew together. We're going to clear that site, restore those graves properly, and make sure they're never forgotten again." Jessica nodded, grateful. This was exactly what needed to happen. "I'd like to go back to the clearing today. There's more to investigate, and I want to search the cabin more carefully." "Take whatever time you need," Mr. Peterson said. "This is important." So that afternoon, Jessica headed back into the forest. This time she had proper equipment, a good backpack, more water, a real camera instead of just her phone, and some basic tools for carefully excavating around the cabin. The hike to the clearing was easier the second time. She'd marked the trail with bright orange tape on her way back the previous day. So finding her way was simple. When she emerged into the clearing, it looked exactly the same, peaceful and timeless in the dappled afternoon sunlight. Jessica spent the first hour carefully documenting everything with her camera. She took photos of each gravestone from multiple angles, making sure to capture the carved letters as clearly as possible. She photographed the cabin from every side, the old water pump, even the spring itself. Then she turned her attention to the cabin. The collapsed sections were too dangerous to explore, but that protected corner, the one with the roof still mostly intact, looked promising. She approached carefully, testing each footstep before putting her full weight down. The floorboards creaked alarmingly, but they held. In the corner, protected from the worst of the weather by that fallen pine tree, she found the remains of life frozen in time, a rusted iron stove, its door hanging open. Broken pieces of pottery scattered across the floor. The remnants of furniture, though most of it had rotted away to nothing. And there, beneath a floorboard that had rotted through, Jessica saw something that made her heart race. A leather satchel, dark with age but remarkably intact, tucked into the space between the floor and the ground below. Jessica's hands trembled as she carefully lifted the satchel out. The leather was dry and cracked but still held together. She carried it outside into better light and sat down on a flat rock near the spring. Slowly, carefully, she opened the satchel. Inside were papers. Lots of them. Some were loose sheets, others were bound together. Letters, she realized, tied with faded ribbons. And a book, a journal with a leather cover, its pages yellowed but still readable. Jessica opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was feminine, elegant despite being written with what was probably a dip pen and homemade ink. This journal belongs to Elizabeth Granger, Montana Territory, January 1st, 1885. Jessica's breath caught. This was Elizabeth's journal. The woman buried just a few feet away had written these words over 130 years ago. She turned to a random page in the middle and started reading. June 12th, 1889. The fever came 3 days ago. First Thomas, then Mary. William has ridden to town for the doctor, but it's 2 days' ride and I fear it will be too late. I do what I can, but they're so small, so weak. The old crow woman who sometimes visits told me the spring water has healing powers, sacred to her people. I've been bathing the children in it, praying it will save them. But I fear my prayers are not enough. Jessica had to stop reading, tears blurring her vision. This was real. These weren't just names on stones anymore. Elizabeth had been a real person, a mother desperately trying to save her sick children, willing to believe in anything that might help, even sacred spring water from local Native American legends. She flipped ahead a few pages. June 15th, 1889. Thomas passed this morning just as the sun rose. Mary followed him at sunset. They're together now, I tell myself. They're not afraid anymore, but I am. I'm so afraid and so alone. William hasn't returned from town. What if something happened to him too? What if I'm alone here with my dead babies and no one comes? Jessica couldn't read anymore. She closed the journal gently, holding it against her chest. This was too sad, too real, too painful even after all these years, but she knew she had to keep reading. Elizabeth's story deserved to be known, to be remembered. The journal was the key to understanding what had happened to this family, why William had sold the ranch, and why these graves had been forgotten. Tomorrow she'd read more. Tonight, she needed to process what she'd already learned, to mourn for a mother she'd never met who'd lost everything over 100 years ago in this beautiful, lonely clearing in the Montana woods. Jessica couldn't sleep that night. Elizabeth's journal sat on her nightstand, and she kept glancing at it, feeling the pull of the story it contained. Finally, around 11 o'clock, she gave up on sleep, made herself some tea, and settled into her reading chair with the journal. She'd brought the leather satchel back with her, and now she examined its contents more carefully in the good light of her cabin. Besides Elizabeth's journal, there were several bundles of letters tied with faded ribbons, some loose papers that looked like they might be recipes or household accounts, and a hand-drawn map. Jessica started with the map. It was beautifully done, clearly drawn by someone with skill and patience. It showed the homestead from a bird's-eye view. The cabin, the spring, a small vegetable garden, what looked like a chicken coop, and a barn that must have been torn down or collapsed completely, because Jessica hadn't seen any sign of it. But what was really interesting were the notes written in the margins. Spring, sacred water was written near the center. Berry bushes, good picking July-August marked a spot to the east. And near the bottom, town 2 days hard ride southwest, that was important information. It confirmed what Elizabeth had written in her journal. The nearest town was 2 days away on horseback. These people had been really isolated, living out here on their own with their closest neighbors probably miles away. Jessica set the map aside and picked up Elizabeth's journal again. She opened to where she'd left off and started reading. The entries from June 1889 were heartbreaking. Elizabeth described trying everything to save her children. Cold compresses, special teas made from herbs, prayers, and yes, bathing them in the spring water. Nothing worked. Within a week, both children were gone. But it was what came after that made Jessica sit up straighter. Elizabeth's entry from June 20th, 1889 read, "William returned today. He'd made it to town, found the doctor, but a bridge was washed out by spring flooding and they couldn't get back in time. The look on his face when I told him the children were already buried nearly broke what's left of my heart. He hasn't spoken since, just sits by their graves hour after hour. I don't know how to reach him. I don't know how to help him when I can barely help myself." The next entries were sporadic and brief. Elizabeth wrote about trying to maintain the homestead, about long silences between her and William, about her own grief that seemed to have no bottom. Then, in October 1889, something changed. The entry was longer, more detailed. "William has decided we need to leave this place. He says there are too many ghosts here, too many painful memories, but I can't bear the thought of leaving Thomas and Mary alone in the ground. How can a mother abandon her children, even in death?" We argued about it today, the first real conversation we've had in months. It ended with him riding off into the forest. I don't know when he'll be back. Jessica turned the page and found a loose sheet of paper tucked between the journal pages. It was a letter, but not in Elizabeth's handwriting. The writing was masculine, blocky, and clearly written in distress. "Elizabeth, I can't stay here. Every corner of this cabin reminds me of their laughter. Every morning I wake up expecting to hear Thomas asking about the horses or Mary wanting breakfast. I'm going mad with it. I know you think I want to abandon them, but I don't. I just need some time away. I need to breathe air that doesn't taste like grief. I'll go to town, maybe pick up some work, clear my head. I'll be back before winter. I promise. Your husband, William." But he hadn't made it back before winter, Jessica realized. Elizabeth had died in 1891. And based on the fact that her grave was here but William's wasn't, something had gone very wrong. She continued reading the journal. November 1889. "William has been gone 3 weeks now. The first snow fell today. I hope he's somewhere warm and safe." December 1889. "Still no word from William. Mr. Miller stopped by last week, helped me chop wood for the winter. He's a good neighbor. Though he lives so far away, I rarely see him. He asked if I needed anything from town. I gave him a letter to post to William, though I don't know if it will reach him." January 1890. "The hardest winter I can remember. Snow up to the windowsills. I've been living off the supplies we put by last fall, but they're running low. Haven't seen another soul since Mr. Miller's visit in December. I talk to Thomas and Mary sometimes at their graves. I tell them stories about their father, about how much he loved them. I hope they can hear me somehow." There was a gap then, several pages torn out of the journal. When the writing resumed, it was February 1890, and Elizabeth's handwriting had changed. It was shakier, less controlled. "A stranger came yesterday, found him collapsed in the snow maybe a mile from here. His horse had thrown him and run off, and he'd been wandering for hours. Brought him inside, got him warm. He's very ill, fever and a terrible cough. I do what I can, but I'm no doctor. He's sleeping now by the fire." The next entry was dated 2 days later. "The stranger passed this morning. I never even learned his name. He was too ill to speak properly, just mumbled about Denver and someone named Catherine. I buried him as best I could next to Mr. Miller. It's too cold to dig deep, but I did my best. The Lord knows his name even if I don't." Jessica paused. That explained the grave-marked stranger, and the mention of Mr. Miller meant that the other adult grave was Jacob Miller, probably a neighbor who died in 1888 according to his headstone. Elizabeth had been taking care of people even in her grief and isolation. The journal entries from spring 1890 showed Elizabeth slowly regaining some hope. She wrote about the snow melting, about planting a garden, about wild geese returning. But there was a constant theme. Still no word from William. Then Jessica reached the final entries. From late 1890 and early 1891. November 1890. I've accepted that William isn't coming back. Either he's dead, or he's decided to start a new life somewhere without me. Either way, I'm alone, but I'm not ready to leave this place. Thomas and Mary are here. This is where their bodies rest, and I won't abandon them. January 1891. I'm not feeling well. The same cough that killed the stranger, I think. It's been going around. According to the last travelers who passed through, I should go to town, see a real doctor, but I can't leave the homestead unattended for that long. The final entry was dated March 1891, and it was barely legible. I'm very ill now. Can't get out of bed most days. If anyone finds this, please know that I loved my children with everything I had, and I loved William too, even at the end. I hope he found peace wherever he went. I'll be with my baby soon. The spring has kept me going this long with its cold, clean water, but I think my time is almost done. Goodbye. Jessica closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Elizabeth had died alone, sick, still hoping somehow that William would return, still loyal to the children buried in the cold Montana ground. But what had happened to William? Why hadn't he come back? And why wasn't he buried here with his family? Jessica wiped her eyes and reached for the bundles of letters. There were 3 bundles, each tied with a different colored ribbon. She chose one at random and carefully untied it. The letters inside were all addressed to Elizabeth Granger at Granger Homestead, Montana Territory. But none of them had been opened. The envelopes were still sealed, the wax brittle with age but intact. Jessica's hands shook as she looked at the return addresses. They were all from William Granger, sent from different towns. Helena, Butte, Great Falls, even one from Billings. He'd been writing to her. William had been sending letters, but they'd never reached Elizabeth. The mail service in the 1890s was spotty at best, especially to remote homesteads. These letters had probably been returned to whatever post office they'd been sent from and just sat there. Unclaimed. Jessica carefully opened the first letter. Dated August 1891, 5 months after Elizabeth's death. William's handwriting was the same blocky script from the letter Jessica had found earlier, but the tone was different. My dearest Elizabeth, I know it's been too long since I left. I know you must be angry with me. I'm angry with myself. I was a coward to run from our grief instead of facing it with you. I've been working in Helena, saving money, trying to figure out how to come back and make things right. I dream about you and the children every night. Please forgive me. I'll be home by winter. I promise this time. Your loving husband, William. But he hadn't made it home by winter. He couldn't have because Elizabeth was already dead by the time he sent that letter. Jessica opened another letter, this one from March 1892. Elizabeth, why haven't you written back? I've sent 5 letters now with no reply. I'm worried. I've arranged to return home in April. Please hold on until then. Please don't give up on me. I love you. William. The last letter was dated May 1892, and it was different. The handwriting was still William's, but it was wild, scrawled, I came home. I found your grave. I found the children's graves. You were alone. You died alone and I wasn't there. I can't live with this. I can't stay in that cabin. Can't look at those graves knowing I failed you all. I'm selling the homestead to a rancher named Peterson. The only thing I asked is that he take care of the family cemetery. I don't know where I'll go. I don't know if I can go on, but I can't stay here with my failure carved in stone. Goodbye, my love. Forgive me, William. The next morning, Jessica spread everything out on the big table in the ranch house kitchen. The journal, the letters, the map, all of it. Mr. Peterson and Tom arrived with coffee, took one look at the display and sat down without a word. Jessica told them the whole story. She read passages from Elizabeth's journal, showed them William's unopened letters, explained the timeline of the tragedy. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. That poor woman, Tom said quietly, dying alone, thinking her husband had abandoned her. And William, Mr. Peterson added, coming back to find her already gone. Can you imagine carrying that guilt? The question is, Jessica said, what happened to him after he left? He sold you the ranch in June 1892, but then what? Did he stay in Montana? Did he leave the territory entirely? And most importantly, where is he buried? Mr. Peterson was quiet for a moment, then stood up. Wait here. He disappeared into his office and came back carrying an old leather-bound ledger. This was my great-great-grandfather's journal. He kept detailed records of everything related to the ranch. Let me see if there's anything about the purchase. He flipped through yellowed pages, muttering to himself, until he found what he was looking for. Here, June 1892, it says, "Purchased land from W. Granger. Man seems broken in spirit. Asked only that family graves be maintained. Paid $200 for deed." Granger said he's leaving Montana, heading east. East, Jessica repeated. That's not much to go on. Wait, there's more, Mr. Peterson said, reading further. My great-great-grandfather wrote, felt bad for Granger. Gave him an extra $50 and a horse. He mentioned something about becoming a traveling doctor, putting his knowledge to use helping others since he couldn't help his own family. Strange fellow, but honest. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. A traveling doctor. He became a doctor? Sounds like it, Tom said. Makes sense in a way. Man who couldn't save his own children decides to spend his life saving others. That's a lead, Jessica said, excitement building. If William became a traveling doctor in Montana in the 1890s, there might be records. Medical licenses, census data, maybe even newspaper mentions if he did anything noteworthy. Over the next 2 weeks, Jessica became obsessed with finding William Granger. She contacted the Montana Historical Society, searched through online genealogy databases, and even drove to Helena to look through old newspaper archives at the state library. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A librarian in Helena, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen who'd worked there for 40 years, remembered hearing stories about a doctor who'd traveled the Montana frontier in the late 1800s. There was a man, Mrs. Chen said, pulling out a folder of old newspaper clippings she'd collected over the years. Doctor who'd show up in remote areas, help people who couldn't afford regular medical care. Never charged much, sometimes worked just for food and shelter. People called him the wandering doctor or the grief doctor, because he seemed to carry such sadness with him. Jessica's heart was pounding as she looked through the clippings. Most were brief mentions in local papers. Dr. Granger passed through town last week. Treated the Miller family's children for whooping cough. Traveling physician W. Granger stopped at our settlement. Saved Mrs. Johnson's life during a difficult childbirth. The articles spanned years, from 1893 all the way to 1918. William had spent over 25 years traveling Montana, helping people in remote areas, never staying anywhere long. Did he ever remarry? Jessica asked Mrs. Chen. Not that I've seen any record of. Seemed like a lonely man. One article from 1905 mentions him having a photograph of his wife and children that he carried with him everywhere. The reporter who interviewed him said Dr. Granger got very quiet when asked about his family, just said they were waiting for him on the other side. Jessica had to take a moment to compose herself. William had spent a quarter century moving from place to place, saving other people's children while mourning his own, carrying Elizabeth's photograph, never knowing that she'd died still loving him, still waiting for him to come home. What happened to him? Jessica asked. Did he die in Montana? Mrs. Chen shook her head. That's where the trail goes cold. The last mention I have is from 1918, a brief note in a Billings paper saying Dr. Granger had moved on to Wyoming. After that, nothing. Jessica thanked Mrs. Chen and left with copies of all the newspaper clippings. She had more to work with now, but she still didn't know where William had ended up or where he was buried. Back at the ranch, she showed her findings to Mr. Peterson and Tom. They were impressed by how much she'd uncovered, but they all agreed the story felt incomplete without knowing William's final fate. Then, 3 days later, Jessica got a phone call that changed everything. Is this Jessica? A woman's voice asked. I'm calling from the Montana Historical Society. My name is Dr. Patricia Hayes. I understand you've been researching the Granger family. Yes, Jessica said, her heart starting to race. Do you have information? I do. I'm a genealogist, and one of my colleagues mentioned your inquiry. I've been researching frontier families for years, and I actually have information about William Granger that might interest you. Could you come to our office in Helena? Jessica made the 3-hour drive the very next day. Dr. Hayes was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a passion for history that matched Jessica's own. She had a thick folder waiting. William Granger, Dr. Hayes said, opening the folder, was quite a remarkable man. After leaving Montana around 1918, he went to Wyoming and continued his work as a traveling doctor. But in 1919, something interesting happened. She pulled out a letter protected in a plastic sleeve. This was donated to our society by a family in Cody, Wyoming. It's a letter written by their grandmother describing how Dr. Granger saved her life when she was a child. Jessica read the letter. It described William arriving at a remote ranch, treating a 12-year-old girl who was deathly ill with pneumonia, staying for a week to make sure she recovered. The girl had asked him why he became a doctor, and William had told her about his own children who'd died, about his wife who'd passed away while he was gone. But here's what's important, Dr. Hayes said. At the end of the letter, the woman describes how Dr. Granger died. He'd been staying with her family, and one night he just passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 72 years old. The family buried him in their family plot and put up a stone with his name. Where? Jessica asked. Where is he buried? Dr. Hayes pulled out another document. A ranch outside Cody, Wyoming. The family still owns it. I contacted them after hearing about your research. They knew they had a Dr. Granger buried on their property, but they never knew his story. They never knew about Elizabeth and the children. Jessica felt tears welling up. He died alone too. Just like Elizabeth? Yes and no, Dr. Hayes said gently. He died among people he'd helped, people who cared about him. And according to this letter, his last words were, "I'm ready to go home now. Elizabeth has been waiting long enough." He was holding that photograph of his family when he passed. For a long moment, Jessica couldn't speak. The tragedy of it all was overwhelming. Two people who'd loved each other, separated by grief and misunderstanding, each dying alone while carrying love for the other in their hearts. There's one more thing, Dr. Hayes said. The family in Wyoming, the ones who buried William, they've agreed to let him be exhumed and reburied if that's what's needed. They think he should be with his family. Jessica looked up, hope blooming in her chest. Are you saying? I'm saying, Dr. Hayes smiled, that we can bring William Granger home. We can reunite him with Elizabeth and the children. It'll take some paperwork, some time, and some money, but if you're willing to see this through, we can make it happen. Jessica nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought about Dusty leading her to that clearing, about finding the graves, about reading Elizabeth's journal. It had all led to this moment, this chance to right an old wrong, to heal a wound that had been open for over 100 years. Yes, she finally said. Yes, let's bring him home. Over the next few months, Jessica, Dr. Hayes, and Mr. Peterson worked together to make it happen. They filed the necessary permits, worked with the Wyoming family, and arranged for William's remains to be carefully exhumed and transported to Montana. They also worked to restore the clearing. Tom led a crew that cleared away the overgrowth, repaired what they could of the old cabin, and most importantly, restored the graves. New stones were cut, faithful copies of the originals but with clearer lettering. The spring was cleaned and protected with a beautiful stone border, and finally, on a cool morning in September, William Granger came home. The coffin was simple, as William would have wanted. It was lowered into a grave right next to Elizabeth's, reuniting them after over a century apart. Standing around the graves were Jessica, Mr. Peterson, Tom, Dr. Hayes, and surprisingly, about 40 other people. Who are all these people? Jessica whispered to Dr. Hayes. Grangers, Dr. Hayes whispered back with a smile. Descendants. I put out some feelers through genealogy networks. William had a brother who had children. These are their descendants. They never knew about this part of their family history. The weeks following William's reburial were busy ones. The story of the forgotten homestead and the separated family had touched something deep in the local community. The local newspaper ran a feature article, and soon Jessica was getting calls from historians, genealogists, and people who'd had their own family members helped by the wandering doctor over 100 years ago. But it was one particular call that led to the most remarkable discovery. Is this Jessica? An elderly man's voice asked one evening. My name is Robert Chen. I'm a retired professor from the university in Missoula. I read about the Granger family in the paper, and I think I might have some information you'd be interested in. Jessica grabbed a pen and paper. I'm listening. My great-grandmother was part of the Crow Nation, Professor Chen explained. She lived near the Granger homestead in the 1880s. She used to tell stories about a sacred spring in that area, a place her people considered to have healing properties. According to family stories, she tried to help a white family whose children were sick, told them about the spring water. Jessica's breath caught. Elizabeth mentioned that in her journal. She wrote about a Crow woman who told her the spring water could heal. That was my great-grandmother, Professor Chen said. Her name was Morningstar. She felt terrible that the children died despite the spring water. Our family has always known about that place, but we respected the graves there and left it alone. We didn't know the full story until now. Over the next few days, Professor Chen shared what he knew. The spring had been considered sacred by the local Crow people for generations before white settlers arrived. They believed the water had healing properties, and there were stories of people being cured of various ailments after drinking from it or bathing in it. My great-grandmother said the spring only works for some people. Professor Chen explained when he visited the ranch in person. It's not magic, but the water does have unusual mineral content. She said it could help with some things, but not everything. The fever that killed the Granger children was too strong for the water to fight. Jessica arranged for Professor Chen to visit the clearing. When he arrived, she, Tom, and Mr. Peterson accompanied him. The moment he stepped into the clearing, the old professor stopped and just stood there, taking it all in. My great-grandmother described this place to me when I was a boy, he said quietly. I never thought I'd actually see it. She said it was a place where the boundary between our world and the next was thin. A place of power, but also of sadness. He walked to the spring and knelt beside it, touching the water reverently. We should test this water, he said. Find out what's actually in it. My great-grandmother wasn't just telling stories. The Crow people knew things about the natural world that science is only now catching up to. That suggestion led to another development. Mr. Peterson arranged for a water quality expert from the State University to come test the spring. Dr. Linda Martinez arrived the following week with her equipment and spent several hours taking samples. The results, when they came back 2 weeks later, were fascinating. This water is remarkable, Dr. Martinez told them during a meeting at the ranch. It has an unusual concentration of minerals, calcium, magnesium, zinc, and some trace elements I've never seen in quite this combination. The water is also naturally cold, staying at about 45 degrees year-round, which would explain its anti-inflammatory properties. So it really does have healing properties? Jessica asked. In a sense, yes, Dr. Martinez said carefully. The mineral content and cold temperature would be beneficial for certain conditions. Inflammation, minor wounds, some skin conditions, muscle soreness. It wouldn't cure diseases like the fever that killed the Granger children, but it would help with pain management and healing of injuries. The Crow people weren't wrong to consider it special. Tom suddenly laughed and everyone looked at him. Dusty, he said. Remember? She had that gash on her leg and she led you straight to this spring and stood in the water. The cold water and minerals would have helped that injury heal. Jessica felt goosebumps rise on her arms. You're right. She knew somehow. Or maybe she just instinctively sought out cold water, and this spring happened to be here. Or, Professor Chen said softly, maybe this place called to her. My great-grandmother believed places can hold memories, hold purpose. Maybe Dusty was meant to lead you here to help you uncover this story. Whether it was instinct, coincidence, or something more mysterious, they'd never know for sure. But the fact remained, if Dusty hadn't been injured, if she hadn't run to the spring, if Jessica hadn't followed her, the Granger family would have remained forgotten forever. As word spread about the spring's properties, more people became interested in the site. Mr. Peterson had to make some difficult decisions about what to do with the clearing. We can't just open it up to the public, he said during a family meeting that included Jessica, Tom, and now several of the Granger descendants who'd stayed in touch. It's a sacred site, a cemetery. It needs to be protected. One of the Granger descendants, a woman named Helen, who was William's great-great-niece, had an idea. What if we established it as a memorial site? We could create a trust to maintain it, keep it beautiful and peaceful, allow people to visit by appointment only to learn the story and pay their respects. That's exactly what they did. Over the next several months, with help from the Granger family, Professor Chen's family, and generous donors from the community, they established the Granger Memorial Healing Spring. The clearing was carefully restored and maintained. The cabin ruins were stabilized and partially reconstructed, turned into a small museum space that told the story of the Granger family through displays of Elizabeth's journal pages, carefully preserved behind glass, William's medical bag that had been found among his effects in Wyoming, and photographs of the couple and their children. A beautiful fence was built around the cemetery, not to keep people out but to mark it as sacred ground. Each grave had a new marker with not just names and dates but brief stories. Elizabeth's read, "Beloved mother who cared for others even in her darkest hours." William's read, "The wandering doctor who spent his life helping others heal while carrying his own grief." The spring itself was protected with a low stone wall that allowed the water to flow freely but kept it clean and safe. A sign explained its history, both the Crow Nation's knowledge of it and how it connected to the Granger story. Most importantly, they established visiting hours and a reservation system. Groups could come to learn the history. Individuals could come to pay respects. And occasionally, with special permission, people dealing with minor injuries were allowed to use the spring water in the traditional way, bathing minor wounds or sore muscles in its healing flow. The first official opening of the Granger Memorial was held on a beautiful spring day, exactly 2 years after Jessica had first followed Dusty into the woods. Over 200 people attended, Granger descendants, members of Professor Chen's Crow family, local historians, people who'd been helped by descendants of William's patients, and of course, the Broken Arrow Ranch community. Jessica stood near Elizabeth's grave and addressed the crowd. 2 years ago, she began, a horse got hurt and ran into the woods. I followed her and I found this place. I found a forgotten story of love and loss, of grief and healing, of promises kept and promises broken. But most importantly, I found a reminder that every person matters. Every story matters, and the past is never truly gone as long as someone is willing to listen. She gestured to the spring, flowing as it had for thousands of years. This water has been here long before the Grangers, long before any of us. The Crow people knew its value. Elizabeth Granger hoped it would save her children. William carried the memory of it in his grief. And a horse named Dusty somehow knew it would help her heal. This spring connects all these stories, all these lives across time and cultures. Today we honor that connection. We remember the Grangers not as tragic figures but as real people who loved deeply, who suffered greatly, and who never stopped caring about others even in their darkest moments. We remember Morningstar and her people, who understood the sacred nature of this place, and we commit to keeping this memory alive, to maintaining this place for future generations. As Jessica finished speaking, something magical happened. Dusty, who'd been grazing peacefully near the tree line, walked into the clearing on her own. She moved through the crowd which parted to let her through and walked straight to the spring. There she lowered her head and took a long drink as if blessing the ceremony with her presence. The crowd watched in awed silence. Then someone started clapping and soon everyone joined in, applauding the horse who'd brought them all together, who'd led them to uncover this beautiful, painful, ultimately hopeful story. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared food at a picnic set up near the clearing, Helen, the Granger descendant, pulled Jessica aside. "I have something for you," she said, pulling an old photograph from her purse. This was in William's things when he died. The family in Wyoming kept it all these years and returned it to us. I want you to have it. Jessica looked at the photograph. It was faded and cracked, but she could make out 4 people, a man and woman sitting, 2 small children on their laps. 6 months after the official opening of the Granger Memorial, Jessica was still discovering new layers to the story. The memorial had become more than just a historical site. It had become a place where people came to heal, to connect and to reflect. One morning, Jessica was leading a small tour group through the clearing when she noticed an elderly woman standing alone by William's grave. The woman was crying softly, and Jessica excused herself from the group to check on her. "Are you okay?" Jessica asked gently. The woman looked up, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm being silly. It's just that this story, it reminds me so much of my own grandparents." Her name was Dorothy, and over a cup of tea back at the ranch house, she told Jessica her story. Her grandfather had been a patient of William's back in 1910 when he was just a boy. William had saved his life during a difficult bout of pneumonia, staying with the family for 2 weeks to make sure he recovered. "My grandfather always talked about the sad doctor," Dorothy said. "He said Dr. Granger was the kindest man he'd ever met, but there was such deep sadness in his eyes. Grandpa said he asked the doctor once why he looked so sad, and Dr. Granger told him he was carrying medicine to others but couldn't heal his own broken heart." "Your grandfather remembered him for all those years?" Jessica asked. "Until the day he died," Dorothy nodded. He always said Dr. Granger taught him something important, that you can carry grief and still choose to help others, that serving others can be its own kind of healing, even if it doesn't take away the pain. That conversation stuck with Jessica. It made her realize that William's story, and the Granger family's story, had lessons that reached far beyond just historical interest. It was about love, loss, grief, healing, and the ways we choose to go on when life breaks our hearts. She started keeping a journal of the visitors who came to the memorial, the stories they shared about their own lives, the connections they felt. The journal grew thick, with entries from people all over the country who'd heard about the Granger Memorial and made the trip to visit. There was the couple who'd lost a child and found comfort standing by Thomas and Mary's graves, knowing they weren't alone in their grief. There was the veteran dealing with trauma who spent an hour sitting by the spring, the sound of flowing water helping him find some peace. There was the young woman estranged from her family who read Elizabeth's journal entries and decided to reach out to her mother again, not wanting to wait too long like William had. The memorial was healing people in ways Jessica had never anticipated. Then came the day that changed everything one more time. It started with a phone call from a veterinary researcher at the State University. "Is this Jessica? I'm Dr. Karen Williams. I've been studying the water samples from the Granger Spring and I've found something remarkable. Do you have time to meet?" Dr. Williams arrived at the ranch the next day with folders full of data and a barely contained excitement. "I've been analyzing the mineral content of the spring water," she explained, "particularly its effect on animals. I tested it on various minor injuries and inflammation in lab settings, and the results are extraordinary." She pulled out charts and graphs. The combination of minerals in that water, along with its consistent cold temperature, creates an almost perfect natural anti-inflammatory treatment. It's particularly effective for horses, actually. The mineral ratios are almost ideal for equine tissue healing. Tom, who was sitting in on the meeting, sat up straighter. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying," Dr. Williams smiled, "that Dusty's instinct to go to that spring wasn't just luck. Horses have an incredible ability to seek out what they need to heal. She might have been drawn by the smell of the minerals or the sound of the water, or maybe she'd been there before when she was younger. But whatever led her there, she knew that spring would help her injury." Jessica felt chills run down her spine. So the Crow people were right. Morningstar was right when she told Elizabeth the spring had healing powers. They absolutely were, Dr. Williams confirmed. Traditional knowledge often has scientific basis that we're only now understanding. The Crow people observed, probably over generations, that the spring water helped with healing. They didn't have microscopes or chemical analysis, but they had observation and experience, and that was enough. This discovery led to another development. With careful oversight from both the Granger Family Trust and representatives from Professor Chen's Crow family, they established a research partnership with the university. Scientists could study the spring's properties while respecting its sacred nature and ensuring it remained protected. The research that came out of the project was published in several veterinary and medical journals. The Granger Spring minerals, as they came to be called, showed promise for treating various inflammatory conditions. A pharmaceutical company even approached them about creating a therapeutic treatment based on the mineral profile, with all profits to be split between the Memorial Trust, the Crow Nation, and research into frontier medicine history. But Jessica was careful to make sure the spring itself remained what it had always been, a natural, sacred place. They refused all offers to commercialize the actual spring water or turn the site into some kind of spa or treatment center. "This place means something," Jessica told Mr. Peterson during one particularly tempting offer from a wellness company. "It's not about money or tourism. It's about honoring the Grangers, honoring the Crow people's knowledge, and maintaining a place where people can come to reflect and heal in their own ways." Mr. Peterson agreed completely, and together they ensured the memorial remained a peaceful, respectful place. As the 3-year anniversary of Dusty's injury approached, Jessica found herself standing alone in the clearing early one morning, watching the sun rise through the pine trees. The spring bubbled and flowed as it had for thousands of years, indifferent to human stories, yet somehow central to all of them. She thought about everything that had happened since that morning when Dusty limped away from the fence line. A forgotten homestead discovered. A tragic love story uncovered. A family reunited after more than a century of separation. Descendants brought together. Traditional knowledge validated by modern science. And through it all, a spring that had witnessed it all, silent and constant. Jessica heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to see Tom riding up on his own horse, leading Dusty beside him. The mare looked healthy and strong, her injury long since healed to just a faint scar on her leg. "Thought you might want company," Tom said, dismounting. He let both horses loose to graze. "Big day today." Today was the dedication of the final addition to the memorial, a statue. The Granger descendants had commissioned a local artist to create something special, and Jessica had been asked to unveil it at a ceremony that afternoon. "I'm nervous," Jessica admitted. "This whole thing has gotten so much bigger than I ever imagined. Sometimes I still can't believe it all started with following an injured horse." Tom smiled. "That's how life works sometimes. Little moments leading to big changes. You could have let someone else track Dusty that day. You could have given up when the trail got hard. You could have just reported the graves and moved on. But you didn't. You cared enough to follow through, to uncover the whole story, to make sure these people were remembered." "I had help," Jessica said. "You, Mr. Peterson, Dr. Hayes, Professor Chen, the Granger family. I couldn't have done any of this alone." "Maybe not," Tom agreed. "But you started it. You followed that horse into the woods when you didn't have to. That took something special." By afternoon, the clearing was filled with people again, even more than the first dedication. The story of the Granger Memorial had spread far beyond Montana. There were visitors from across the country, including several families who'd discovered they were distantly related to the Grangers through genealogy research prompted by news articles about the memorial. The statue stood covered by a tarp near the spring, its shape mysterious beneath the fabric. Jessica stood beside it with Helen, the Granger descendant who'd become like a sister to her over the past 3 years. Mr. Peterson spoke first, welcoming everyone and talking about how the discovery of the homestead had changed not just the ranch, but the entire community's understanding of their history. Professor Chen spoke about his great-grandmother Morning Star and the Crow Nation's connection to the spring, about how traditional knowledge and modern understanding could work together. Then it was Jessica's turn. She stepped up to the microphone they'd set up, looking out at the sea of faces. She saw the Granger descendants, scattered throughout the crowd. She saw local ranchers and historians. She saw the research team from the university. She saw people she'd never met before who'd traveled here because the story touched something in them. And standing calmly near the back, as if she knew this day was important, was Dusty. 3 years ago, Jessica began, her voice carrying across the quiet clearing. "I was just a ranch hand doing my morning rounds. I saw a hurt horse and followed her into the woods. I had no idea that simple decision would lead to all of this, would bring all of you together, would uncover a story that had been waiting over 100 years to be told." She paused, gathering her thoughts. The Granger family story is tragic in many ways.